Welcome to Suffolk Matters, where all of Suffolk County meets the men and women of Suffolk AME. News, opinions, and insights you won't hear anywhere else. Here's your host, the president of New York's largest independent union, Suffolk AME's Dan Levler.
Welcome to another edition of Suffolk Matters on Walk 97.5 and 94.3 The Shark, where Suffolk County meets the men and women of Suffolk AME. News and views you can't hear anywhere else.
So my guest this morning is Laura Ahearn. She's the Executive Director of the Crime Victim Center, Parents for Megan Law. And I want to thank you for joining us this morning. I know how busy you are. I appreciate you carving out some time to be with us today.
My pleasure to be here.
I think it's worth noting that you have been an advocate in your community and also an advocate working closely with our AME members, especially in DSS and Child Protective Services over the years. But tell us a little bit about Parents for Megan's Law.
Sure. The agency actually started, imagine this. It was a dot matrix printer. This is years ago, in one tiny little spare room of my house with a computer and that printer. And it started with printing flyers because we had some problems in New York State with the community being notified about registered convicted sex offenders.
Yeah.
So that's actually how it started. And 25 years later, because we don't have time to go through all those 25 years, but 25 years later, with really building wonderful relationships in the community, with folks at AME, with legislators, with just parents who were really wanting to get information they were entitled to under the law.
Yeah.
The agency built itself with prevention education, victim services, and also law enforcement support. So it really did start as this little place in my house and grew to be a multi-million-dollar agency just from the incredible support we have in the community and incredible staff at the agency that are committed and dedicated to protecting children and providing help when people need it.
Sure. And you know, what you guys do, I think when people understand what it is you guys do, they can understand the passion behind it. But it had to start with you having that passion and pushing things forward to grow it to where it is now. So for any of our listeners who might not be familiar with what it is you guys do and the results of what you guys do,
we're like an organization that literally started with just providing advocacy for families that didn't know how to navigate the system when their child was sexually victimized. So it literally started that way.
Sure.
And then education. So school districts were getting information, or parents in school districts were getting information about registered sex offenders in their community. But superintendents at the time didn't know what to do with it. Law enforcement didn't know what to do with it. Right. No one knew what to do.
Right.
So I was literally a social worker who just had young kids, and I got involved because no one knew, what do we do when we find out there's a registered sex offender in our community? Right. So we put together the first Megan's Law helpline, which grew to be the national Megan's Law hotline, the only one in the country.
Right.
Then we wrote grants to provide prevention education. So we do prevention education for schools and parents and businesses from K through 12, and then we also do college student education. And that education includes information about relationship violence, preventing bullying, and sexual assault prevention, and also hate crime prevention. Some of our work is in that arena too. So the agency really is made up of 3 units. One is prevention education, one is crime victim support services, and one is the law enforcement support services that we provide. We have 7 or 8 retired law enforcement folks that range from lieutenants to detectives, and they work hand in hand with law enforcement here in Suffolk County to ensure the sex offender registry is up to date and accurate. That's like a prevention component, working to ensure that registry is there and it's up to date. Yeah. The advocacy and victim services is a critical part of the agency's mission, and that's where we have a lot of interaction with AME, with DSS, and with CPS. And our position has always been prevention is key. Yes. And CPS and DSS, they don't get enough resources to be able to do the work that has to get done in our community. So I'm a strong advocate for ensuring that not only do they have the resources, but the staff and also the knowledge. You need more attorneys helping your CPS workers who are going into people's houses, making determinations, and they don't have the legal guidance that we feel that they need, only because they don't have the resources.
Yeah, we have been advocating, and there's a number of times throughout the years where I've been at the Suffolk County Legislature advocating on the record. I've gone upstate to speak to senators up there, ended up on the record on that as well. But, a huge component of all of this from our perspective is when you say resources, it's staffing, but it's also training, right? And there are different levels of threat out there, and one person can't learn how to do all of it properly. There's got to be some specialized care within government to identify these things. But I will say, I think it is a huge fear of a parent to be faced with the threat that something like this could have happened to their child, or will strongly motivate them to do everything they can to prevent something like this from happening to their child. I mean, it is something that would completely change the course of their lives, being the victim of a sex crime, and again, at any age. But the fact of the matter is, parents are especially attuned, young kids, and that's, some of the crimes that you hear about are just absolutely heartbreaking. So, again, I want to commend you for all your efforts. You could have, like so many other people said, there should have been a solution, and instead you made the solution. You helped work with other partners to build up, again, like you say, this national network, and working hand in hand with government to protect people. I think that's huge.
Well, thanks for saying that. And I have to say, there are so many other things that go on under the surface that people in our community are not aware of. The great advocacy that you do, because without you, you're not going to get the training, you're not going to get the resources, you're not going to get that specialization. And I wholeheartedly agree, there needs to be specialized trainings and specialized units, because when you get involved in a case so complicated, sometimes it's difficult to untangle what's happened, because you have a child that is making a report of something and a parent, and often you have circumstances that are really complicated. Maybe there are some issues, lifelong issues that have been going on in families. We don't know. And these folks are going into homes with the complete unknown history. You could have 50 years of history that a determination has to be made immediately. They need more help with that.
And I've always said, so there's this kind of guidance. It's not a standard. It's just guidance. Like, hey, maybe you shouldn't carry more than X amount of cases. But every case is unique, and every level of intricacy and difficulty, So if someone were to say, okay, a caseworker has 12 cases, well, if there are 12 intricate, difficult cases, that's way too much, right? If it is a more standardized, easy to follow, and like I say, every situation is unique. But that being said, a case is not just a case, right? Exactly.
And that is exactly, that sort of leads really well into, for us as an organization, we have, as I said, the Law Enforcement Support Unit, Law Enforcement Support Services Unit. Then we have our Prevention Education Unit. But the Victim Services Unit is similar to kind of what you're talking about in terms of case management. We have cases that range from the easier cases where maybe it's a criminal mischief, where somebody has destroyed an elderly person's mailbox, but with a bat, with a baseball bat. Kids that think it's funny, but that elderly person can't now they can't get their mail. They have to spend money on having concrete laid into the ground so they could put a pole so somebody doesn't destroy their mailbox. That might be a quicker case, obviously, compared to a homicide. And we're working with sexual assaults, we're working with domestic violence, and a domestic violence case is going to take a lot longer than maybe an identity theft case or somebody who lost $1,000 versus a case maybe where somebody lost their entire life savings, $300,000, $400,000 in an IRA or 401k, stolen from them. That's going to take more time. Just like the sexual assault, just like the child sexual abuse case, it's going to take more time. There's no easy way to do it. It's almost as though we need like a grading system, and we do that within the agency. If it's a violent crime, we manage caseload based upon how many violent crimes we have. If it's a homicide, it's going to take a lot longer, a lot more casework and coordination compared to, as I said, a property crime committed against an elderly person.
Right. Yeah. And, I think specifically when we talk about victims of sexual abuse and focusing on the sexual abuse and violent crimes, there really is a component there that I want to say this the right way. There's a component there that impacts the victims much greater than when we're talking about something like you talk about somebody smashing a mailbox. I think that would be terrifying for an older person to say, I would never think that something like this would happen to me. What else could go wrong? What if next time instead of my mailbox they do something else or whatever? So there's all of that for them, and they're going through something, right? And I fully understand that they're going through something. But when you talk about especially kids, but victims of sexual abuse, there is a level of intimacy there that really I think eviscerates somebody psychologically in a very different way. It's much different work.
It absolutely is, and it takes really dedicated and committed advocates, because when a child is sexually victimized, or an adult as well, there's a significant level of trauma that they experience, and that trauma is carried out through their entire life. And if they get services in the immediate aftermath of the crime, it's been demonstrated in the literature that they're less likely to experience long-term PTSD, they're less likely to be re-victimized, and they're much more likely to participate in the criminal justice process. So in the Victim Services Program, our goal is to get to individuals that are victims of violent crime as soon as possible, right, because that would ensure that they get to counseling, they get to work with our advocates that will do crisis intervention, 24-hour hotline support. We have therapists right there in the agency that can talk to them immediately. And most people don't know, if you're a victim of a violent crime, we help to facilitate the return of any of your expenses related to that crime. So anybody who's a victim of violent crime, if your insurance isn't covering something or you don't have insurance, we get it paid for. And the agency has helped to bring back over $7 million to crime victims right here in Suffolk County. And I have to commend Suffolk County Police Department, our Suffolk County executive, because we have a program that's a National Association of Counties award-winning program, and that's the Crime Victim Center Support Services Program, where we, every time there's a crime committed in Suffolk County, our advocates get that information to proactively reach out to the victim, or in cases of homicide, surviving family member, to help to facilitate services immediately. So we get in there, provide those services, and there's nothing that's going to take back what happened to them, right, but we can help to stabilize the circumstances and get them into the services that they not only have a right to have, but desperately need.
Yeah, and that knowledge and know-how, these things exist, but when you're the victim and you don't know where to go and what to do, I think this is a great spot for us to just kind of jump in with how do people get in touch with you guys?
They can easily get in touch with us, actually. All you have to do is look online, crimevictimcenter.org, crimevictimcenter.org, and we actually have a 24-hour chat, or they can contact us at 631-689-2672. We also have a 24-hour hotline, 631-334-1392. All they have to do is look in Google for Crime Victim Center, and they will find us immediately.
Give us those numbers again.
So the best number to call is actually the office number, because it gives you all of the options from there. So it's 631-689-2672. And the website is easy. It's crimevictimcenter.org.
No, it's very important. I can imagine as some folks are hearing about this, not knowing that this is an available resource, and especially if they're driving in their car, they're going to want to keep this in their head. So we're going to mention this a few times. If you're listening and you're interested, we're going to mention these numbers and the website a few times. So let's talk a little bit about how your work overlaps with government, specifically legislation to start with. What kind of work are you guys doing on the legislative front to create better laws to protect victims?
So we can advocate for legislation. So we're not official lobbyists, but we can advocate for changes. And we right now are very much focused on preventing the elder parole bill from passing. The elder parole bill would allow for violent offenders that are in state prison no matter what their sentence was, from giving them an opportunity to come before the parole board earlier than what their sentence was if they're 55 or over and have been incarcerated for 15 years or more. So we're really in opposition to that legislation when it comes to, or that potential law that could be passed when it comes to violent offenders. Individuals that have brutally murdered, sexually assaulted and murdered women and children, cop killers, individuals that have absolutely no regard for humanity. We do not want them to have that opportunity to come before the parole board early. And some folks have said, well, it's not that they're going to be released. It's that they're coming before the parole board to be heard. What's the big deal? Well, it's a really big deal for families who every 2 years have to lodge a public campaign because a parolee would be entitled every 2 years to come before the parole board and argue their case to be released. So the family of a child who is raped and murdered and dismembered, literally, because that's what happens, and those are the crimes that we deal with, that offender would come every 2 years, which means that family has to lodge a
relive the trauma
campaign and relive the trauma. Exactly. And that's just not just.
And so, just to reframe it, I think it's clear, but I just want to say it. What we're looking at here is an approach to victims advocacy. It is not about the person who's been sentenced. They had their day in court. The judge made their decision. This is about making sure, your position on this bill is making sure that the victims don't have to go through the trauma time and time again.
Exactly.
And, I can think off the top of my head of a number of high-profile cases, and I'm sure our listeners can think of it as well, folks that have been in for 15 years and are over the age of 55 that have done horrible, horrible things. And, to put families through that is a lot. So point well taken.
Yeah, it's just that, thank you. It's not fair to them. And those are the families that we stand side by side with when they're seeking our support and our help. And they're just not in support of that. If somebody has committed a property crime and is in state prison for a property crime, that's a whole different circumstance than somebody who's committed a violent crime against another human being. So, and then there are also some crimes of passion or crimes that are different. They have a different indicia than somebody who violently rapes and murders another person or commits a violent murder.
Sometimes multiple times,
Exactly.
It is a thing they like to do, right?
Exactly. And that's not, we're just not going to be in support of that. And also there's attempts to legalize prostitution. And we work with individuals in the human trafficking court there's one particular person we work with who used to be in that lifestyle and is so grateful that law enforcement picked her up because it brought her into a different world of people can help me. I can get help getting my driver's license, getting my birth certificate, getting training to have a vocation. She was pulled out, and she's strongly in opposition to it. So another thing, too, is being able to ensure that victims' rights are preserved. So when there's a crime, that those records are preserved so that later on when they come before parole, the offender, that the victim has all of those documents that she can send to the parole board for review.
Right. That's very
There's
important.
an endless list of those items that we want to ensure that victims' rights are enforced and also expanded. But to just recap what you said, it is all about a victim-centered approach.
Sure.
And community safety.
And, I just want to touch on a little bit. We talk about, sex workers, and we talk about the potential option of opening that up. And I think most people have exposure to that line of work through TV shows and movies and whatever else. And that is a very glamorized example. And I would say a very large majority of the people that are in that line of work are victims themselves.
I would agree.
They don't know another way, and they are forced to do this, and they don't realize there is another option and that there is a whole other life that they could live that the rest of us are. They are being exploited.
Agreed. And some of the arguments to move that legislation forward is just contradictory to what our experience is as advocates who've worked with women who are sex workers, and that's that most of them have been sexually victimized as children. Most of them never got any help, any kind of therapy or counseling. And Many of them are opioid addicted or have substance abuse disorders and are controlled by an individual that pays for their housing, pays for their clothing, pays for their food, and they're trapped.
They're trapped.
So they have no control over their own lives, and we just want to give them that opportunity. That's what a human trafficking court does.
Yeah.
They're picked up, brought in there, and assigned an advocate and offered an opportunity to move forward and get those resources they deserve.
And I guess I got to talk a little bit, and I'll say it. I don't need you to agree, but there is an ugly side sometimes to this legislation. When things like this get considered, there is a component on the side of elected representatives to, if there's money changing hands, it should be taxed like anything else. And to what extent there's a bottom line number in discussing, sex work in general. And you say, well, just so you know, if you were to legalize this, there would be X amount of dollars in tax revenue every year and blah, blah, blah. And while it is their job and responsibility to evaluate that as a component, it's my hope, and I know it's absolutely your hope and the folks that you work with, that first and foremost, it's about the victims of this. Like I said, I believe that they're being exploited, and that should be the consideration over recurring revenue.
Agreed, and I would add to that legalizing prostitution here in New York State would be perpetuating the victimization of men and women and of children. It would be absolutely adding to it, and it would be disgusting to me if there were any kind of attempts to benefit financially for taxpayers. That would be outrageous.
Sure,
absolutely
sure.
Outrageous.
Yeah, I can think of a lot of ways this could go wrong, and while the question is in front of them, I think first and foremost they need to be thinking about the victims of these crimes and not any other aspect of what the legislation might mean.
When you drill down on that, just as a side note, when you drill down on what's happening now with human trafficking court, there are a few human trafficking courts across New York, across the state, but mostly on the South Shore, Long Island, Queens, New York City, and the metro area. They don't have the therapists that they need assigned to the court. So we can't even get a counselor, so somebody to do a mental health evaluation for that human trafficking victim or for a prostitute. We can't get an evaluation to determine what that person needs. We have to use that from a different grant to get the evaluation.
Right.
So they're missing, like what's happening right now at DSS and CPS.
Sure.
They're missing the very critical services they need to be effective. So the answer is not to just put a Band-Aid on it and say, oh, well, let's just make it legal and benefit from it financially. That's outrageous, and it's so irresponsible.
And the better legislation is to put those components in place so that the people are being served best.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the responsibility, I believe, that a legislator has, a state lawmaker, county lawmaker, and federal. They need to be looking at solving the problem, not trying to benefit financially from the problem.
Right. No, I agree. And again, my guest this morning is Laura Ahearn, Executive Director of the Crime Victims Center, Parents for Megan's Law. And for those that might be interested in getting in touch with them and learning more about what they do and using their services, the website is crimevictimcenter.org. And the main number to call, the best number to call, is 631-689-2672. So in working with government, we talked a little bit about legislation and the analysis there and advocating and making people aware of what certain laws might do well or do poorly. Additionally to that, you do work closely with folks, our AME members at the Department of Social Services and Child Protective Services specifically. So how have you worked with these professionals in the past?
It's all about building relationships. So when we can start maybe on a broader level with elected officials, starting with the federal legislators or federal lawmakers. When there's an issue that becomes a national issue, we reach out to them and we define what the issue is, and we will typically provide scenarios. So if there's a situation, we had a lot of work that we did with Senator Schumer federally with Megan's Law. I helped to rewrite the National Megan's Law. It's the Adam Walsh Child Protection Act. It was really an honor for me. Senator Schumer had me invited to the Rose Garden when the president signed off on that legislation. That was just an amazing experience for me. But it was really about our staff finding out from parents in the community what's wrong. So usually, I think what we're really good at as an agency is when there's something really wrong in the community, we really make an effort to try to dig deep to solve the problem. Look at what could be done to solve that problem. Right. And then from there, go and try to work with whichever body of law it would be, whether it's federal, like I said with Senator Schumer, or state, because we did have a lot of issues with Megan's Law 25 years ago in New York State. And then on a local level, what can we do? So I think it's just the fact that whenever there are problems that are solvable, that aren't going to be overwhelming for a lawmaker to be able to stand behind. And if it is overwhelming for that lawmaker to stand behind, we'll go to somebody else. So if somebody is not willing to work with us, we move to the next level. And we've had a lot of challenges ever since the state turned from Republican to Democrat. We've had a lot of challenges when it comes to issues that are victim-centered, because when we work on a victim-centered issue, it's perceived by certain individuals that are not suburban-oriented lawmakers, it's perceived as anti-defendant. And that's just not what we're trying to do. We're just trying to stay victim-centered. But when you're purely defendant-centered, you're ignoring or tone-deaf to what's happening to the victim. So we've had challenges with that.
It's not lost on me that some defendants are victims themselves, And that being said, that shouldn't diminish the victim's rights in any of these issues. And so when it comes to legislation, when it comes to presenting these issues publicly and getting consensus of the people, while the defendant has rights, so does the victim. And if we ignore the rights of either one of those groups, that's not a good thing.
It's not. And I think that the pendulum swung. And that was one of I know there was a big discussion about bail reform. There were major mistakes. We absolutely had to have changes. I sit on the Suffolk County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. And I'm the chair of the Legal System Subcommittee for the Task Force to Prevent Family Violence. So I'm around a lot of the processes in the county and in the state. And what was happening is individuals that were poor, individuals that were maybe the underrepresented, those individuals for nonviolent offenses, tickets, they were being incarcerated, couldn't pay bail. That's not just.
That's not justice, right?
It's not. But it's also not just to be allowing a person who's been in state prison for 15 years or more and 55 or older and killed a cop or murdered a child or murdered an adult to let them have a chance at biting a bite at the apple to be released. So you have to think in a common sense way. And the problem we have right now in our whole entire country is that it's one way or the other. It's one side or the other. It's extreme on each side. And for somebody like me, I'm right in the middle, and I orient myself on what's right for that population, what's right for the community, what's right for victims, not what is politically correct. And that's what's wrong right now in our country. It's just too extreme.
Yeah, and listen, when you're looking at the extreme on one side or the other and ignoring the other side's points of view and just looking to, I guess, win the argument, then you're missing the truth of the situation, right? And again, when we talk about bail reform and we talk about everything that we're talking about today, there's a lot of discussion about defending the rights of the defendants, right? But the fact of the matter is the victim has rights also. And so both sides need to consider that as we're setting up legislation, as we are enforcing the rules that are there. From day one when we were talking about bail reform, taking the decision away from judges, to me, was a safeguard for society that was in place, right? Leaving the ability for judges to decide in cases of violent acts and some of these more extreme crimes that are now bailless. leaving the judge to have the discretion to say, okay, well, on today's issue, I see that you did X, and it fits this column that says I should let you go, but I've got 3 gun charges, I've got this violent act, I've got that, whatever, and when I look at it all together, I just don't think we can let you go today.
I agree wholeheartedly. In fact, New Jersey has dangerousness and many states have dangerousness as a criteria. And New Jersey, because the other side argues, because I know their arguments, because I want to be informed when I say something of the position that I have, that there are assessments that are developed that have been proven to be assessments that are not in any way biased.
Right.
Because if the argument is that certain assessments are biased towards certain individuals, then let's deal directly with that. Let's actually look at that problem and solve it, not talk about it and do press conferences about it, but actually sit down at a table and solve that problem. And New Jersey did. So I don't see why in New York State judges shouldn't have the discretion to decide dangerousness. They should.
And I believe we can. The question I guess I have for you, and I feel like I know the answer, but do you feel like on this bail reform that we have just essentially created more victims?
Absolutely. And we have cases within the agency where there are people that are afraid to come forward because of the fear surrounding. And some people say, well, it's just extremism, and some of it is, but some of it's not. It's real.
Right.
Level 3, we have resources that are allocated toward identifying and finding out where absconding sex offenders are. You do not want a sexually violent predator who's absconded to be picked up and brought back, but then released again. Right. So that's what was happening in the beginning, and then they fixed that. So for level 3 sex offenders, they can't just release them. But now for level 2 and 1, we have level 1 is determined by a risk assessment to be a low risk of reoffense. But in our opinion, it's a high, higher, and highest.
Yes.
So a low risk sex offender is a high risk for us.
Low risk is 0. Right. You've never done it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
But in Nassau, there's a level 1 sex offender who sexually assaulted or raped a 4-year-old. So how is it that a level 1 sex offender who rapes a 4-year-old is not a level 3, a high risk?
And this is why it's a huge concern when we talk about defending the defendants and their rights. You still have to consider the rights of the victims.
Absolutely.
And that 4-year-old for life and their family, and the community as a whole being aware of this whole situation. Everybody's affected. Yes, the defendant has their rights.
Yes.
And yes, so does a 4-year-old child.
And so does the community, right?
Yep.
Because as a level 1 sex offender, Dan, he will drop off the registry
You're not
after 20
suggesting
years.
I'm a level 1.
Oh, no, I'm just making the point that after 20 years, level 1 sex offenders drop off the registry. So he's going to go about unnoticed in the community. And when somebody does a background check to see if he's a registered sex offender,
Doesn't show.
it's not going to show up. And not every league and not everybody is, we tried. Believe me, on a state level, we tried to mandate any kind of sports league, you had to do a sex offender registry and a background check. We couldn't pass that.
Right.
How is that possible that couldn't pass?
I don't know how that level of involvement with a 4-year-old is not considered egregious, right?
Yes.
That it would be considered a level 1. I don't understand that. Someone somewhere must know the answer to that. It is certainly not me.
Me either.
So just one more time, again, I understand it's a very heavy subject material, but there are people out there that have been affected by this and they really need the help. The Crime Victim Center knows how to connect the dots and get you to resources. So I want you guys to hear again. If you want to go to the website, it's crimevictimcenter.org. And the main number to call, which will give you all of your options, 631-689-2672. That's 631-689-2672. I'm going to do it one more time. 631-689-2672. And Laura, thank you for joining us today. I know there's so much more that we can talk about, but I want to give you an opportunity. I've been asking the questions that I've had. Is there something that you want to get out, you want people to know about?
Sure. First, I want to thank you because you're an incredible advocate for AME. and for all of us in Suffolk County. So thank you for your hard work. We're also having our very first, and we're calling it annual, charity golf outing because we're hoping there'll be a second and a third in the future. It's on May 22nd. Windwatch Golf and Country Club in Hauppauge. You can find out more about it by going to crimevictimcenter.org/events. And we have John Guadagno from the president of IBEW helping us on the host committee, Marty Arasich from Building and Construction Trades, and Josh Slaughter from LiUNA. And we're really excited. There's sponsorship opportunities, and for those golfers, it's going to be a lot of fun, lots of good food, and lots of great raffles and cash prizes. It's
a great way to help your community. These are things that happen to a whole community. It's not just an individual that gets affected by this. So, again, I want to thank you, one, for joining us, two, for all the great work that you do for the people that desperately need it, and three, for finding ways to even expand and improve on that. So, again, my guest, Laura Ahearn, thank you for joining me this morning. And to our listeners, we'll speak to you next week.